us. Thank you so much, Daisy, for joining us today to talk about your exhibition, to always help you remember me, that is part of the Forgetting Is So Long series. And I'm so glad we could meet over Zoom. This is the technology we have. As the gallery is here in Seattle, Washington, and you are in Amherst, Massachusetts now. Is that correct?
I'm in a small town near Amherst. Yeah.
So to just jump right in, one of the first questions people ask me is, "Where are you from?" And that feels like a straightforward question, but the answer is you were a bit of a nomad for a long time, living in LA and then Oklahoma and then Massachusetts and Colorado and Seattle where we met, and then back to Massachusetts. How has kind of being a nomadic person inspired your work or influenced your work at all, or how?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes, I've lived in all of the time zones of the continental US, which is its own thing. I'm originally from Los Angeles, and I left when I was 9, and I moved to Oklahoma, and then I moved back to California, but to Bakersfield, which is where Korn, the band, was from. I think that's the only time people know what Bakersfield is. And then went back to Oklahoma. I did a year abroad in the UK while I was in undergrad. And then my grad program was in Boston. And then we moved to Colorado for my partner's PhD program. And then he got a postdoc in Seattle, which is why I moved to Seattle for a whole 9 months. And now we're here in Massachusetts again, in Western Mass. And so, I think that whole experience encompasses a huge breadth of different types of people and different types of ways of being. And I think all of those things kind of permeate my work. I think most of my work is trying to understand people just in general, and having such a wide-ranging background. And of course, I know the United States is not its only sort of ecosystem, but being also exposed to various groups of people and all of that sort of thing has really sort of influenced how I think about my work in general. And I, of course, love travel, and I hate being stuck in one place. So, surprise, surprise. Yeah.
So one of the things that you touched on, and a couple of people have mentioned in coming to see the show, is that it's very multicultural. The show is made up entirely of women, and they're all from incredibly different backgrounds. We have women from Lebanon, women from Egypt, women from Nigeria. Was that a conscious effort, or were you just looking at images of these women that you just loved? Because I have to love all
Yeah.
of them.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, it's hard not to. So, the way that I sort of think about the overall body of work is I'm thinking very much about who gets remembered and why, and how that sort of functions. And a lot of the photographs that I collect, I'm thinking, there's a little bit of falling in love with each sort of collection. I have about 5,000 photographs at this point, still collecting. And, for each one, it's a little bit of a falling in love process. And then that love gets sustained to be printed and becomes a painting. And then hopefully that painting succeeds. And a lot of the collecting and a lot of the selection choices come from a reflection of my own sort of relationships and my own sort of experiences with different people. And so, sometimes certain folks will remind me of other people. And that's something that I also think is really important for the context of the audience coming in and seeing the work, is that even if they're looking at someone who may not look exactly like them, it will remind them of something about their own family or something about their own life. So, for me, my father is Iranian. My sister's father is from Belize, and she's Black. my husband is from Venezuela, and it's not a like I'm trying to collect them all kind of a thing, but more of just like having these sort of like honest connections and relationships. And for me, really overall, the whole body of work is very much about connection and sort of facilitating this back and forth. It's why the work itself is life size. You're meant to reckon with the person again on a one-to-one basis. And so, if I'm thinking about sort of bringing these people back into the present where we can encounter and interact with them in a very specific sort of way, I really want to be mindful of who gets to be in that sort of space. And so that's sort of how I think about how I'm collecting the images overall. And I try really hard to be mindful of what kinds of images I'm collecting. So not historical photographs of like specific events. I'm not looking for photographs from like newspapers. I'm not looking for ethnographic photographs or photos of the Western gaze and the other. I want to be really mindful that I'm looking specifically for images that are of a family photograph context and were held and were considered dear to the family members. So that's kind of like how I think about them. Yeah.
Oh, that's wonderful. I was chatting with a curator in the gallery the other day, and he said, "Oh, all of these photos are, they were taken by a photographer. That means an appointment was made, and someone went to a place and they put on their best dress and their best outfit and sat, and the lighting was set up for them. This was a very precious moment, not for anyone else except for them and whoever they were giving the photograph to." So I find it really interesting because part of what you talk about in Forgetting Is So Long series is the concept of death and how we die two deaths when we die and when we're forgotten. And having these dear, precious family photos, knowing that they were discarded, and you're kind of giving them this new life, is very poignant to me. The question in there is, you're giving these people this new life, but you're also connecting the present to the past. And I feel that we see a lot of the past in black and white. And correct me if I'm wrong, but most of the photos that you're using are older black and white photos that you're infusing with tons of color.
Yeah, I think that color is a way of sort of part of the process of re-enlivening. So, in the context of death, I was initially a painter, and then I became a photographer when I hit a painting block, and then I returned back to painting through the bridge of photography and photo theory. And so the way that I'm sort of thinking about the photograph itself is that it is, this moment of death, which is to say that that moment that happened is no longer now. And this is part of like Roland Barthes and the way that he's sort of talking about and thinking about the photograph as a medium and as an object. And so, time is really static in the photograph. And because it's a moment that has passed, many times the people within the image have also passed in some regard. I am specifically selecting certain types of images. And, I'm thinking a lot about, I don't want the images that I'm collecting to be totally contained within the context of like nostalgia or sentimentality, because I think those things make it very hard to sort of have the same sort of connection with someone. So, with that, thinking about time as this like really static object, it's very immovable and very like of the past. Painting to me is this sort of other medium that really breaks those kind of rules. It's very dynamic. Time is not linear. It's very chaotic, honestly. That's how I think of it. And, that to me is what's really interesting, is like looking at these old images and sort of stripping away some of the artifacts of the past, not completely erasing, because I think it's important to not flatten out that sort of information, but you start to see this connection with these people and be like, oh, actually, we're not that different and we're not that removed. I'm thinking a lot about painting art history in terms of how painting portraiture was sort of less about the exactitude of the person and more about a likeness or a sense of being. And I think color is something that for me, I don't have color as a sort of direct symbology where this color represents this or this color represents that. I love color just generally, which I think is probably going to come through from the work. And, to me, I'm thinking about color relationships and sort of the feelings that they evoke. And I want to leave it open ended enough. I have my own personal sort of relationships and thoughts, but I really want to leave space for the viewer to come in because I do think that, in general, most artwork is not complete without a viewer of some kind. And, it doesn't have to be a huge audience, but I do think there's something about what you bring to looking at artwork that sort of makes it happen.
Well, let's talk about too. I mean, the colors incredibly vibrant. The paint is so thick and juicy, and your patterns are just phenomenal of different flower types of leaves. Where are all of those coming from?
So one of the other things I'm thinking about with this overall body of work is there's an anthropologist named Michael Taussig who talks about defacement of sacred objects. And of course, he's talking about anthropology, but how this sort of defacement sort of shocks the object back into being. And so an easy way that I like to think of it is if you're in a park or somewhere else and there's a monument of some kind that's been vandalized and suddenly you notice it again instead of just kind of walk by and not pay attention. So to me, a discarded or abandoned family photograph is a sacred object. It was sacred to the family members who once had them. So, I still have the original objects, but to me, sort of intervening with them with paint is a way of sort of shocking them back into being. They're present. And paint, just in terms of color and texture is one way. And then the other way is pattern. And so, for me, pattern has so much history across time and across space and across various countries and cultures and everything else. And initially, the body of work was really sort of influenced by 19th century wallpaper, especially like William Morris. And of course, all of those folks were in this back and forth cultural exchange during that period too. I now make my own sort of patterns a lot of the times. So I have a lot of like old botanical illustrations that I will convert into either a more graphic design or sometimes I'll render it depending on how I'm feeling on that given day and what makes sense for the piece. I also will go around on like nature hikes and other spaces. And if I see a shape, I'm thinking about it in the context of this sort of like the shape and the formal elements of it and what makes sense. I'm thinking about pattern as ornamentation and decoration, a way of embellishing and beautification of the person and of the painting itself. Sometimes the pattern is also maybe adjusting composition for a vernacular photograph that's not maybe well composed, or it's underlying relationships or providing sort of connections. There's one piece of two Bulgarian women where the pattern is emerging from the other person and sort of encircling the other woman. And so, having that sort of like tendrils coming out and sort of holding or touching, I'm thinking about that. And then, also it's a formal element in terms of like adding additional like color and texture and everything else. So it's doing a lot of things all at once, in addition to having these different sort of references of the historical and everything else.
One question that comes up quite a bit is, and I think you have touched on it a little bit with the defacing, but you tend to paint a hot color over the eyes, over the face, over the hands. Some people find it a little off-putting, and other people find it like, oh, I'm drawn in a little bit more. What is your intention behind that?
I'm thinking about when I'm painting each piece, I think that paint is a way of sort of asking the viewer to pay a little bit closer attention. So when I'm partially obscuring something, I want you to lean in a little bit more and really pay attention a little bit closer, whether that is obscuring the face partially with flowers or a wash. To me, a wash is in that context of that loving act of remembrance, thinking about the slippages between the living and the dead, and what that sort of looks like, and of course across cultures and across time. So, to me, sometimes the washes are, I sometimes think of them in the context of like almost like the being is glowing, like the person is glowing in some way, or emitting some kind of light. Um, but that's not necessarily how I think about it all the time. I've, like I said, I've had some folks who really love it and think about it in the context of auras or other aspects of their own spirituality. Um, and I really like, and it's not a wishy-washy, but more of just like, I like openness in artwork, to where you can have space to inhabit, and and part of that is the interaction back and forth with the person. It's an invitation to the viewer to say, please come here and listen for a little bit and see what comes of it.
Take a closer look.
Yeah.
Um, so when we first started talking about the show, we kind of had this concept of you had done some couples paintings of couples, big wedding portraits, big family portraits, and we had talked about this idea of, all right, let's focus on women and how they present themselves. When putting together the work for this show, I mean, that was like a conversation a year ago. When putting together the work for this show, how did that influence? Like, how did that conversation of women presenting themselves influence what ended up in the exhibition?
Yeah. So, and sort of going back to the idea around who gets remembered and why,
Mhm.
I really am drawn towards certain types of individuals, both within my collection process overall. I have a lot of women in my photo collection, probably way more than men. And part of it is that I'm also looking for an openness and a vulnerability. Um, and vulnerability doesn't necessarily have to be this like, I think oftentimes people see vulnerability in the context of weakness. I don't. Sometimes I see it in the context of strength, like the woman behind you, I think, has this strength and presence to her. Exactly. Um, and I have a man behind me, actually. So I do paint men. I also have had some people who've been like, "Oh, you only paint women." I'm like, "Well, you know what? That doesn't encourage me to change my mind." And part of it is, I think that, in terms of thinking about the gaze, in terms of thinking about who gets represented art historically, in the context of, our overall society, all of those things, women and, anybody who's not a man, basically a cishet guy, is perceived in this manner that is very an object. You're not a person, a whole person. And so to me, I'm really interested in sort of digging into that. In addition to that, when we think about families and family history, when we're looking back at lineages, it's so easy for women to sort of just slip through the cracks of like their last names are gone and erased every time they get married, they're considered property, all of these other sort of historical aspects. So I have a special fondness for women in general, and thinking about the ways that women have sort of passed down what they can in the ways that they can, having some aspects of agency over the course of time. And so I've been working very much in that sort of context of representation of women, and so that's why I wanted to continue it with. When I'm thinking about who it is that I'm choosing to paint, it really is this sort of aspect of this person has this presence that is just so powerful that comes across all of these years of time, that it's impossible not to be drawn towards them and have this sort of like back and forth with them. So that's kind of sort of what I'm thinking about. And yeah, I also think what's really interesting is like so much how we present ourselves for the camera is very similar, regardless of where you are and what time period you are. And I know that there's a finite amount of poses that you can do just in general, but also there's something that's sort of really interesting about that sort of universality of this is who I am and this is who I want to present myself for future generations. I mean, you're thinking about yourself in the context of the right now,
Right.
but a photograph can last for so long that it can become something that is collected, decades, a century later that someone can hold on to and think about.
Lovely. And I will say there's nothing, I mean, they are very feminine, but they're not. There's this, they're powerful. I mean, when we walk through the exhibition, the first kind of piece you see as you enter the door is the Lebanese woman. This um, big, pink, imposing. She is a powerful lady, and we don't know who she is. And I think that's interesting. Is that all of the women in the show are completely anonymous, unless a name was written on the back of their uh, on the back of the photo that you originally found. So we have this anonymous Lebanese woman who is just imposing over the gallery and kind of holding court with all of the other ladies who feel like they are just here to take over in some ways.
Yeah.
Having
Yeah.
them all in one space is remarkable.
I love that you said that, Judith, because for me, so I should say I'm not slagging off femininity. I think it's great. I wish people would embrace all things, just in general. But in terms of like them all together, like my best self and the way that I like to work in general is in the context of a show and works all together. I think of them as sort of like mini families. And I think of shows in the context of each piece is a phrase or a little snippet of a sentence, and then together they're this like thesis or this essay or whatever else that are all talking to each other. And so I'm sad I can't be there because I think that that's something that's really important for me, is to be able to I'm making the work in my studio and obviously I'm seeing it there, but there's something very transformative about it being physically together in a space, and especially beautifully installed the way that you have, that I think really adds to the work and its power. And I've had folks who have come in and seen pieces installed that, when they see it on a tiny little computer screen, it's they think, oh, it's collage or something else. They don't realize the scale. And
Yeah.
then also sort of the power of being able to like interact with this person again in a very specific way. I've had people be really moved emotionally in ways that they were not prepared for, that I can sometimes access when I'm in the context of a show and seeing it again and being like, oh, look at how they're all sort of like speaking to each other. So yeah, I'm really glad that you mentioned that, because that's something that's very important to me.
Well, and I'll say too that they're transformative for any space they end up in as well. I think when we first met, I was like, I must have this painting, and the piece I own of your work is it's in my home office, and she stares at me every day, and I love her every time I see her, and it's not just the color, it's not just the explosion of brightness and like this very calm demeanor. It's just her presence is there, and I think to what your intention of re-enlivening anonymous people and giving them a new life is absolutely true. Like, she's part of my family. I find myself in the gallery going, oh, this one reminds me of my grandmother, because she kind of looks like my grandmother. And oh, I think this one is probably a photo of this lady, but earlier. Like, now I'm coming up with backstories of who they could have been, and why they ended up here of all places.
Yeah.
So I think there's this transformative quality in your work, just whether intentional or not, it transforms a space, and it helps.
Yeah. Yeah, and what you just said about the back and forth, I think is something that I find to be really powerful and a way of sort of like facilitating these kinds of connections where we're seeing the person for who they are and imagining what their lives were like. And then we're also thinking about our own family members or our own selves or our own friends, people who are dear to us. And we're creating these connections across space and time that I think are just really lovely and kind of beautiful. And I think that it is very often sort of a privilege to know what your family history is. On my father's side, I know that he's Iranian, but I didn't grow up with him. And so I'm missing that whole section of my family. And, I think that embedded in all of this work is this sort of um, desire and longing that comes with the thing that I hope is that when audiences come and see the work, that um, that dislocation of time and space can be sort of taken away to where you can have this like moment that is present. Even if you're looking at someone who is separated from you by time and by distance, that they're there with you at that moment. It's also why I get really excited when people decide to live with my pieces, because I think that's something that, I think I think the idea that painting stopped being this sort of like interactive experience is a false one. At least it is for me. I think that painting changes depending on the time of day, the light, how you're feeling, all of those things, just like any piece of artwork. And I have a couple of my own pieces. I don't keep my own work, but I do have two that are very special to me. And yeah, I mean, it really changes, and there is so much presence, and there's something that's really kind of delightful of having that person. That's partially why I kept that one piece, is because I just was so connected. I was like, well, you have to live with me. You can't live with someone else.
Daisy, thank you. It was so nice to have you join us. Um, this exhibition is on view in the gallery between now and the 22nd of May. Galleries open Wednesday through Saturday, 11 a.m. to 5 p.m. and by appointment. Please come see it. There's some lovely paintings. You're invited to come spend some time with them. Is there any final things you'd like to share, Daisy?
Oh gosh, I think that the pandemic makes things a little bit challenging, because I do think, or I feel that spending some time really, really taking in each person is something that I find very valuable when audience members do that. And I always love to hear what people think about each particular piece, because I think that what I'm really interested in is emotional connection. And I hope, it's my goal with all of the pieces, is that there is some kind of emotional connection with each one. So.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you all for watching. Have a great night. Bye.